All right, welcome to this episode of Crime Inc. Every episode, we're going to take a look at an aspect of criminal justice system through the eyes of one of our guests. My name is Alexander Benikov, and I'll be your host. I'm a defense lawyer, author, adjunct law professor, and I've been interested in the world of crime and punishment for pretty much as long as I can remember. Today, our guest I'm very excited to have is Professor Jonathan Simon, who teaches I call it at Berkeley Law, but it has a different name, correct?
That's our kind of current name. We were known for many decades as Bolt Hall, but it led too many people to be confused as to whether we had two different law schools in town.
Is it still officially Bolt?
Well, the building is really Bolt Hall. The money is formally named. The school was never named for them, but the teaching was all done in a building named for the Bolt family, whose money I believe was, given back around World War I, so it's been a while. But I think our new dean would be very happy to discuss naming rights with any of your listeners.
I don't know if you ever saw the show Billionaires, but there's a scene where the hedge fund billionaire main character wants to buy the rights to one of the New York museums, and they don't want to sell the rights, but he makes them a huge enough offer. I'm assuming most universities are similar.
I think that's true. And unfortunately, we were once a proud public university that needed very little assistance in the way of philanthropy, but those days are long gone.
Yeah. Times are changing. I wanted to have Professor Simon on for a couple of reasons. His work, and I'll have him introduce a little bit more about himself, but me being a defense lawyer, a lot of my clients end up in prison, or at least jail, or some kind of incarceration. And after they go away, I don't really talk to them. I talk to some of them once they get out. And a lot of my clients have been in prison once or twice or many times. But I wanted somebody who's researched this from an academic background as far as some of the cultural reasons, political reasons that have led us to our current prison situation. Professor, can you give just a little bit about your own background and kind of what led you to this?
So personally and biographically, I'm a baby boomer, just about to turn 58. I very much grew up in the era that I often somewhat tongue-in-cheek refer to as sort of the zombie apocalypse of crime era, when people who lived in cities like Chicago, where I grew up, experienced, or at least felt like they were experiencing a great deal of violent crime around them, and also from the Nixon presidency on, a lot of rhetoric about getting tough on crime. So that was kind of a personal introduction, even though I didn't start out in life thinking I wanted to be a criminologist or a student of prisons. And then in terms of my graduate student here in California in the 80s, at a time when the prison population really took off. And so I got interested very quickly in that. And I've spent much of my career kind of trying to figure out what was driving that prison growth, what it meant about our political and legal systems, and finally what it meant about our basic humanity as a culture.
Understand. About how long have you been researching prisons and jail? Has it been most of your career, or it's fairly recently? Pretty
much the whole time. I mean, I was doing my dissertation research here in the mid to late 1980s, so about 30 years ago. And so I like to think of it as about 10 years into the era of what we would now call the era of mass incarceration. And
we also share that we spent some time in Michigan. I went to law school there, and then I worked at the public defender's office in Ann Arbor as an intern.
Oh, no kidding. Well, we'll have to, I have a dear friend, cousin, Steve Adams, who's worked in that office for many years. And yeah, I love Ann Arbor. It's a great place. A good friend of mine, Lauren Brown's been there also. I'm sure they know each other. Indeed.
He was my supervisor. As far as, can you give us, and obviously you could spend hours talking about this, but just kind of a short history of how prisons and corrections changed in the country in your book, which was really interesting, which I'd recommend to everybody. It's kind of seemed like it started in the 70s as far as the change in how we looked at prisons culturally and politically.
That's right, or at least that's a very important turning point. I mean, I'm now realizing through some of my historian friends that you can look further and further and further back and try and see the roots of what we did in the last 40 years, going all the way back to the birth of the prison in the 19th century and maybe all the way back to the birth of sort of political punishment, you might say, state punishment in the 16th century in Europe. But I think something really changed beginning in the 70s because corrections, to use a term that almost seems strange now to use for the business of prisons, had evolved from at times really atrocious and cruel conditions as a norm to, at least in the most progressive and advanced industrial states like California and Illinois and Michigan, certainly in the mid-20th century, to at least commit themselves in principle to the idea of rehabilitation, and in practice to relatively reducing or at least not growing the use of imprisonment. In fact, it's kind of striking and to look back and realize that in the last 20 years before we kind of lurched into mass incarceration from like the late 50s into the early 70s, our prison populations were shrinking. And it was partly because most criminologists and penologists and actually lots of governors and legislators thought, to use a favorite expression of one of Britain's past home secretaries, that prisons were an expensive way to make bad people worse. And that if we were going to do something to correct people who were involved in crime because of their drug addiction or their lack of education, et cetera, it would be much more effective to do it through community corrections. That was the big idea going into the late 60s and early 70s. And that hit this cultural turning point that I really think is rooted in essentially the generational experience of the rising baby boom generation, of what David Garland, the great sociologist, criminologist, has called sort of the culture of high crime. The change in a culture that comes about when people either experience or believe, and they're the same thing to some extent, that there's a real chance that their life could be ended or horribly mutilated by an act of violence, which sadly is a real phenomena for some portions of our community, some neighborhoods that have very high homicide rates. We can talk about why our country's homicide rate and violent crime rate have dropped a lot in the last 25 years. But it was quite a real experience of belief in the 70s. And, if you grew up in a place like Chicago, as I did, people were leaving the city then, ironic and current, given how popular cities like Chicago are now, but people were fleeing the cities on the assumption that being in them was an unacceptable risk of violent crime. Gated communities had yet to be invented yet, but people were already looking for the most secure real estate they could find. And it was against that background, I think, that politicians came to realize that policies of building and filling prisons, regardless of the expense and regardless of how poor a job they did in rehabilitating people, would be a politically safe and indeed very, very effective strategy for a while to come. And it shaped both parties, I would say. The Republicans kind of got off to maybe a quicker start with Richard Nixon's presidency, but LBJ was desperately trying to get on top of the crime issue himself, and basically it's a bipartisan story.
Professor, so in the 70s, was there actually more crime, or was it more of a perception, or what led to, because it sounds like there's a shift in what people thought?
I think there was more crime. Lisa Miller of Temple, where is she? Lisa Miller of Rutgers University, has a recent book out called, that's well worth reading, called The Myth of Mob Rule, which argues that against the idea that sort of fear of crime was just kind of a politicized myth, that she argues there really was a significant increase in violent crime and in ways that went beyond, in some ways, the neighborhoods that we often associate the most poorest, most segregated, most discriminated against neighborhoods where we still see very high crime rates today. I think that the best explanation for sort of why it happened, it lays in the transformation of American cities in that period from just before my birth. I was born in 1959, but if you were to kind of look at a kind of some kind of a quick motion photography of sort of big cities like Detroit and Chicago from a few years before my birth until, say, I went off to college in 1977, You would see rapid deindustrialization in many of those cities, with the big job centers disappearing, moving either to the suburbs or the south of the U.S. and eventually to Mexico and other places. And just as importantly, you would have seen a massive disruption of the urban infrastructure as cities built with federal assistance giant highways right through the hearts of many of their oldest and in some ways most vibrant but low-income neighborhoods. And so if you look at it from the point of view of what criminologists like to call informal social control, and everyone agrees that sort of however much we can do with police and prisons, a formal social control apparatuses like that, it's a small portion of what basic informal social control, the moral disapproval of your family and your friends, your community, people's willingness to intervene in preventing crime just in that's happening in front of them, clearly took a massive hit in those years. And a lot of social scientists are taking a close look at it now to try to see if they can, actually find statistical patterns that will bear this out. But I find it very compelling as a theory, at least. Unfortunately, Americans at the time drew a different conclusion, which is that we were facing an unprecedented generation of predators, criminals. In the 80s, they would start calling them super predators, just in time to be completely wrong, but because crime started going down in the 90s. But the assumption was, in a very racist way, I think, that the black population, which had grown larger in most big cities as a result of the Great Migration, had brought to the North, Midwest, and West a population that was highly prone to crime, and that perhaps even further discombobulated by welfare and by deindustrialization, crime was now going to be out of control unless this population was brought under significant social control from police and prisons. And there's so much wrong with that theory that I wouldn't know where to begin. I mean, I could teach a whole course on why that judgment, why that judgment was really a misguided one, but it was completely in line with a history of kind of blaming blacks, basically, for whatever social problems were being generated by the larger political economy of the era. And it began really as early as the turn of the 20th century, when progressive criminologists like me, but in that era, actually emphasized the criminality of black populations as part of their effort to normalize immigrant populations and convince a very nativist U.S. voting population that immigrants from Europe were not the main threat. And that's the work of Khalil Muhammad, another great contemporary historian, has documented that.
And that would be impossible to imagine happening again, right?
Exactly. Because we've progressed so far from that it's it's actually my work now increasingly is struggling with what I think of as the legacy of our embrace of eugenic thinking in the early 20th century, which this racing of criminality was only a small part of.
Yeah, and we both know enough about how voting works and who works, and how to get people riled up. Whether it's this last election or, I think America has a long and sad history of, we need to fear this group, whatever it is, so like you were saying, whether it was, black people from the inner cities, or now it's, Mexican or South American immigrants or whatever it is.
Right. And in California, if you want to get really tripped out by the kind of mathematical regularity of it, if you roll back more or less 30 years from the 70s, you get the Japanese internment, which was the first time actually that the phrase mass imprisonment started to be used by American critics.
Right. And I'm a Russian immigrant. I'm a Russian Jewish immigrant. So, whenever they start talking about the immigrants.
Exactly. I'm from, my grandparents on my father's side were Russian, and it was very much understood, certainly by my father's generation, that Russian Jews in that era were viewed as a highly criminal population.
Yeah. You were talking about in the 70s as far as how prosecutors started to change how they were sentencing and what they were charging people with. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I think as far as how it relates to the changing attitude, towards crime and fear, I'm sure that was I'm sure there was an intersection there.
I mean, that's an argument that I began to develop, or a point in my earlier book, Governing Through Crime, and I think it's really been borne out now by some empirical work by scholars like John Pfaff, who has a recent book on sort of the role that prosecutors really played in driving the growth of incarceration. And it's an important part of the story because we tend to focus on governors like Rockefeller, presidents like Nixon, or legislators, and obviously they played a big role. But prosecutors are at the very heart of America's criminal justice system in every era because they have enormous discretion as to what crimes to charge and what sentences to seek. And well before there was any significant shift in the sentences toward the kind of 3 strikes and you're out sort of long sentences that we're now very used to, in the 70s, while most sentencing laws were still relatively lenient, and indeed legislators were still kind of interested in shrinking prisons to some extent, prosecutors began to use their discretion in California and many other states to use the prison as a sort of tool to remove what they considered to be a kind of criminal threat from their cities and their communities, buying into this idea that we lived in an era of sort of super predators among us that we needed to kind of hoover up, as the British would say, and send to these prisons. And prosecutors are, as I said, the great secret of American law and politics, because almost no other society in the world has this peculiar configuration of giving the magisterial power of the law really to decide what the law means in a particular place and time to an agent who's basically a locally elected political entrepreneur.
Yeah, and we've had that issue here in Phoenix and Maricopa County, where we've had some of our, county prosecutors, with peculiar policies. And, I've had prosecutor friends complain to me, and I've been practicing about 8-9 years. So, fairly recently, where they have these mandatory statutes and, sentencing guidelines. And, I've had countless prosecutors on my own cases say, I wish I could offer you this, but our policy is that, it's prison mandatory or whatever it is, even if it's not, statutorily required.
Well, my hope is that, there's some change going on now, even, in prosecutors' offices, partly because of electoral pressure, and that, we can talk about the change agenda. But if it's going to happen, it's really going to have to happen in places like Maricopa County, Alameda County, Los Angeles County. It already may have happened in places like Harris County, Houston, which used to send, I think, the overwhelming majority of death row inmates to death row, and now is the whole state of Texas actually has some fewer death row prisoners to death row than Los Angeles did last year.
Oh, wow. So the prosecutors start charging more people start going to prison, and I guess it's kind of a chicken and egg thing as far as how we get so many more prisons, and then we start filling people. So how does that happen, if that makes sense?
It's a complex story that is now being richly, laid out by a lot of great scholarship. Heather Schoenfeld has studied Florida and has a book coming out, and some articles. Mona Lynch studied Arizona, your state. You should take a look at her book. Old Western Justice, Sunbelt Justice, which is a great account of Arizona's path to mass incarceration. And Arizona is a good example, since you're in that state. There you actually had litigation against what was very Southern-style, cheap but extremely brutal prison system, very racially marked in the 1960s. Lawsuits attacked that, building on a whole model that was successful around the country in terms of court reform of prisons in that era, which is to say, accusing the prison of basically failing to address the rehabilitative goals of prisons. And so ironically, Arizona was in some ways inching a bit closer to the sort of rehabilitative ideal approach to imprisonment that states like California and Michigan had been advocating for years. But the very stimulus and of court orders requiring notoriously, obviously, spending unhappy about spending legislature in Arizona to have to cough up big bucks to build prisons that were more modern and up to judicial standards really helped to open the door to this prosecutorial surge of imprisonment. So, the surge of imprisonment was creating greater and greater problem of overcrowding. Human rights lawyers hoped that might force a reckoning in which Arizona's prisons would either be closed or replaced by more rehabilitative ones. Instead, what we got was a wave of new prisons built up to, and just up to judicial standards, but without any intent of rehabilitating people, really an intent of warehousing people. And different paths, took place in most states, but in a lot of them, litigation was an important part of the story. Over time, California is another example, built close to 20 prisons, far more than existed at the time, in this period, initially to respond to court orders, but eventually as part of a quite, vigorously politically endorsed, mandate to use prison as a way of reducing the crime rate through incarceration.
And I don't remember the exact number. I think you said there was just a handful of prisons built before that, and then when the construction really ramped up.
Yeah, you had 2 prisons in the state until close to World War II, and then a handful more. I think they got up to about 12 by the end of the 60s, and those prisons were designed to be relatively small, aimed at particular rehabilitative goals, like working with younger offenders or with people with mental illness issues as part of their criminal behavior. And they were the prisons that we built in the 80s and 90s were so different. And that's in some ways really the heart of the story I wanted to tell in Mass Incarceration on Trial, because American prisons have been failing from the very beginning and have always left unsatisfied their claims of rehabilitation and often produced horrendous results. But that was kind of a stinging rebuke to the political legitimacy of prisons as institutions that were supposed to create rehabilitation and over time to change criminal behavior. But beginning in the 1980s, we built prisons knowing that they wouldn't achieve any goals like that and intending only essentially to warehouse people who we thought would be committing crimes if they were in the community otherwise. And that was a very, going back to our earlier discussion, that was a really significant change, I think, in the kind of checks that existed on the system. Because even while the system regularly failed in the past, its very aspiration to rehabilitate created all kinds of mechanisms to kind of check the problems of overcrowding and of accumulation of very medically and psychologically vulnerable prisoners, mechanisms like parole, which most states had and California used vigorously until the 70s and we got rid of, mechanisms like judicial discretion to essentially move somebody into the mental health system rather than the prison system if they thought that was in order. And that went out the window, leading us to a situation which I think nobody intended, really. I don't think anyone said, let's create prison conditions that will constitute torture, even in the eyes of the U.S. Supreme Court, and be easily comparable to conditions in third world or developing world prisons. But that was a kind of an inexorable result of committing ourselves to this breakless, embrace of incapacitating as many of the people we feared as we.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
I
got you.
I lost you there. I lost you for
sorry.
It's good now.
I don't know where I spun out there. I'll try to stay still. No, I pace around, so I may be moving away from the best position.
No, you're good now. And what's interesting now is that, for people my age and younger, people maybe even over 40 and younger, it seems like, we don't remember prisons any other way. I'm sure you saw 60 Minutes had a really good piece on, I want to say it was either Holland or somewhere around there, maybe Denmark, about their prison system. And, I'm sure you've seen more of the in-depth research, but it's really amazing, the difference, the conditions and how they treat people. They interviewed one guy who's convicted of murder and he's allowed to go home during the week. there's a lot more education, and then you see the conditions in our prisons, and it's hard to imagine that they both constitute prisons.
No, I think that's really important for people to, because we could easily kind of come to the conclusion, and we may that that prison is we now associate it with such bad conditions and such a wasteful use of resources and such terrible treatment of fellow citizens and human beings that abolition or getting rid of prisons altogether may strike many people. It strikes many of my students as the best answer, and yet given the centrality of incarceration in our current practices, I don't think we can afford to, treat getting rid of the prison as the only goal worth fighting for, even if it's a goal worth fighting for. We need to think about what better prisons and jails would look like. And there are models around the world. I mean, we once were a model for other countries, but now there are models around the world. And unfortunately, the U.S. is not used to looking at other countries as potential sources of technologies or institutional ideas. But for those of us that do get a chance to travel around the world, there's a reckoning with the fact that America's institutions, prisons are right at the heart of that. Really look bad on the scale that we like to imagine ourselves today.
Yeah, we like to think we're the best.
We're the largest, right?
Yeah,
we can take the prize of having the most people in prison, but that's not anything to be proud of.
This might be a good place to get into, and you kind of alluded to supermax prisons, but can you kind of talk about their growth, how they became part of our culture?
I think they're a great kind of indicator, if you will, of the larger phenomena of mass incarceration, and they've been brilliantly portrayed in one of my students, I'm proud to say, Karamat Ryder's book, 23/7, which is about Pelican Bay. Not the first supermax in the country. In fact, Arizona, I think, was the first state to build a supermax. The feds built a version of supermaxes as early as the 70s. But California did something unique, which was to embrace supermax on a grand scale, building two giant supermax prisons. I should briefly say that a supermax prison is basically a prison in which it is assumed that the prisoners are going to remain in their cell virtually all the time. They have to be let out under current court standards, basically an hour a week for either showering or exercise, or I should say an hour a day, which is where you get the 23/7. But the place they do that is often either a shower stall or an exercise space that is just essentially an open air version of the cell that they were in. The idea is that originally that justified this is that some prisoners were so dangerous in the early 70s as a result of some of the political turmoil in prisons. There was a real spike in killings of correctional officers as well as killings of prisoners by correctional officers. California had one of the most infamous incidents, the George Jackson's uprising or takeover of the San Quentin Adjustment Center in 1971. Attica, a few months or a month later, which was horribly misreported, as Heather Thompson shows in her great book, Blood on the Water. And that helped to frame this idea that our prisons were full of these kind of super predator criminals who you would need a kind of high-tech cage to hold. And this is, highlights sort of a world in which rehabilitation plays very little role. If you're really dealing with somebody who's that kind of a menace, you're not worried about rehabilitating them. You're worried about just keeping other people safe from them. And so that was the sort of premise. But in California, they supersized it, recognizing, I think, eventually that it's not that they really had a huge army of this super predator kind of criminal that they needed this for, but recognizing, all right, I started a movie again. Let me move back to recognizing that in prisons without rehabilitative programs, without educational programs, without parole opportunities, essentially without any carrots to keep prisoners interested in maintaining good order and decent conditions in terms of violence, that you would have a real powder keg. And in fact, race-based prison gangs are the dominant, essentially, social order in California prisons. But from the state's point of view, only this threat of supermax incarceration could be a sort of stick big enough to control a prison population with so little to lose. And so far beyond any other state I'm aware of in the U.S., California used Supermax for essentially permanent incarceration of many prisoners that they considered to be gang active members. And there, much has been written about how little it takes to be defined as a gang active member or an active gang member in a prison gang in California. It does not anything like proof beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law.
Yeah, it's hey, you've got this tattoo that we think may be associated with so-and-so.
And so we've made some progress now. California has settled an important civil rights suit brought by the Center for Constitutional Rights called Ashker versus Brown. But you get a sense of how bad things were by the terms of the settlement. I mean, the class of prisoners and the condition that was being challenged as a violation of the Eighth Amendment was people that had been held over 10 years in these Supermax conditions. Whereas according to the UN's Special Reporter for Human Rights, more than 17 days in Supermax conditions borders on degrading conditions or torture. And indeed, that's now part of the UN's Nelson Mandela prison standards.
I've often thought about how I would, because, I have a hard time sitting still for 10 minutes, being quiet. I've often thought about, how my mental health would do, if I was locked up 23 hours a day. I'm sure there's probably some pretty amazing research out there, right, as far as the kind of effect that has on somebody's well-being.
I mean, those were the first really powerful accounts of the nature of these Supermax prisons were from some of our great prison advocate psychologists or psychiatrists like Terry Kupfers, like Craig Haney at Santa Cruz, who working with the human rights lawyers that were litigating on behalf of prisoners, interviewed scores of these prisoners, have written books and articles that have been cited all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the irony here is that back in 1881, I think it is, in the 1880s at any rate, the U.S. Supreme Court actually had an opinion in which they reflected on the 19th century experience with essentially solitary confinement, which had been used at Auburn Prison in New York. Initially, people were held in these tiny rooms, nonstop. And it was ended within a decade because most of the prisoners became insane. And the governor actually pardoned all of them in response to the horrible treatment. And the U.S. Supreme Court, writing, decades later, said, holding people in solitary confinement is one of those things that American penology has recognized as unacceptable and that we've turned our back on, or something like that. And so to have a century later to be back doing it, and the U.S. Supreme Court has never opined that it would violate the Eighth Amendment, although Justice Kennedy has written a very powerful concurrence, which I'm proud to say is the only time that the U.S. Supreme Court has ever cited my work in a case that did address Supermax conditions.
For people, and I'm sure some people have seen documentaries or shows about these cells, but can you kind of give a description of what like a typical cell might look like, the typical kind of conditions?
I mean, that you would think if you were going to keep people 24/7 in a single cell, then that cell would be designed to create the most opportunity for different activities, etc. But far from that, they were almost deliberately designed to be sensory deprivation experiences with sort of all concrete interiors. Often the bed and kind of table seat are all concrete. Maybe the only thing that isn't concrete is the sort of toilet ensemble, which is brushed aluminum. And even more grimly, what you can see. First of all, the only natural light is typically through a slot type window that's well above where the prisoner can see, and the only way to look out would be through a grill over the cellway, the door, because again, these aren't bars; they're actually metal doors. With the idea that bars are too vulnerable to these kind of super predators reaching out and hurting someone. So these are like metal boxes, and at least in Pelican Bay, when they look out, what they see is a concrete wall across essentially the walkway from the cell they're in pods of 2-story pods of sort of rows of these cells looking out at a concrete wall that's the same color as everything else. So literally, I mean, imagine that. Not even a mural or just some color or something to look at. As you were saying, you could easily imagine losing it. I'm somebody who's has a hard time with claustrophobia generally, and I just imagining myself in one of those cells, it takes me about 30 seconds to start shaking.
Yeah. To play devil's advocate, if we had somebody from the prison union or, I don't know if there's pro-prison people. I'm sure they call themselves something else.
Well, no, the California Correctional Peace Officers Association is one of the most powerful, and they have excellent public relations people that you should interview, and they're an interesting group. I think what they would say is that they don't get to choose the laws in California that may disincentivize prisoners to otherwise behave well, although they do have a lot of influence actually on the legislature through their significant contributions. But in any event, that they certainly view this as a tool that they think is necessary to protect themselves from prison gangs. If you visit any California prison on a sort of tour guided by the correctional officers, they'll certainly show you an ensemble of weapons that they have recovered from prisoners. I think there's a couple of things to say in response. One is that the numbers don't really bear it out. That if you look at the number of prison officers killed or wounded, it's extremely low today. And they might say, well, it's a measure of the success of these supermax prisons. But I guess time will tell as we begin to draw that population down a bit. Something I would say that I think correctional officers and those of us who want to see dramatic changes in prisons can probably agree on is that current prison conditions with many medically and mentally vulnerable prisoners are extraordinarily challenging for workers in that setting to maintain any kind of dignified relationship to the people that they're supervising, and they really haven't been given sort of positive tools. I mean, when I look back on the rehabilitative era and this idea that prisoners would go to therapy and go to education classes and that the parole board would consider that and grant them early parole, even if that never documented to sufficient degree to satisfy social scientists like myself that they, quote, worked to rehabilitate people, they certainly worked to create a kind of moral economy inside prisons where prison officers and prisoners could kind of get along in a sense and go through the motions of a somewhat legitimate public order in prisons that didn't depend on this very violent system of solitary confinement. And it created essentially a basic dignity that prisoners and prison officers could live with. Prison officers didn't get to create the system we're in now, although they have supported it. I think they have a real stake in changing it because they're the ones that spend long hours, often overtime hours in settings that, as I said, are degrading to their prisoners, but they're degrading to the prison officers too. And one of the things I like to say is, if the Eighth Amendment commits us to anything, it's to prisons that respect the human dignity of the people we imprison there and the people that we employ to keep them there.
Yeah. As far as the determination who goes to what facility, as far as California, I'm sure different states have different guidelines, but is it the prison bureaucracy and the organization that determines where somebody goes? Like where they're housed?
And I think that's true in most of the country. And that's important for listeners to understand, because you can imagine situations in which a court might sentence somebody to say be in a supermax prison, because of the horrendous nature of their crimes, at least at the beginning of their sentence. But in fact, most of the use of supermax is by correctional administrators making a decision either in response to a disciplinary event, like an assault on a correctional officer or another inmate, or, and more commonly, unfortunately, more disturbingly in California, in response to a correctional officer's judgment that this particular prisoner is an active gang member.
And that was a really interesting part of your book, and it kind of reminded me of the famous Catch-22 book, where you can only get out of the military. I don't remember exactly. You can't say that you've lost your mind, but if you do, you can't get out. It kind of reminded me of that in the sense
and again, I have to credit Karamat writer who has a wonderfully titled article, "Parole, Snitch, or Die."
Yeah.
Those are the ways out of the supermax. And
yeah. So if you're inside, those aren't great choices, right? Once you're in the super confinement.
They're not great choices. And we should point out that one of the reasons things are happening somewhat to reduce this now is that prisoners in the supermaxes in California valiantly organized a hunger strike, not just once, but twice, once in 2011 and I think again in 2013, or it may have been again in 2015. In any event, that hunger strike, which at its max, I think something like 30,000 prisoners in California were refusing meals for at least some days, got a tremendous amount of attention. And it was brilliant on two levels. One, it completely showed that the basic premise of the supermax was wrong on its very thesis. I mean, the prison's claim was that by putting these gang leaders in these supermax cells, they would sort of liberate the rest of the prisons from the influence of gang members. But if these gang leaders could actually organize a meticulous hunger strike across all of the prisons from these supposedly sealed off cells, then even the basic security myth was just that, a myth. But also because it reminded people that these are human beings. I mean, they weren't calling for, transportation to a socialist country like the Attica prisoners initially did in 1971. It was a different era. They asked for pictures of their families, seasonally appropriate clothes and hats, an opportunity to leave, to qualify to leave the supermax based on some kind of rational criteria. Really basic human rights goals, and I think that really reached people who heard it.
And that kind of brings me to my next question. You talk about the war model of prisons. Can you kind of explain that?
Well, I think that is where prison officers had their own kind of micro but intense experience of the kind of zombie apocalypse of crime that I believe the baby boom generation in its kind of early adult years experienced. For many prison officers and people looking at prisons, 1971 was the pivotal year, and I've already mentioned the two events. One was less known because it really was a California-only event, and that was the San Quentin uprising. But the death of George Jackson, the great prisoner rights advocate, Black Panther prisoner, whose own life was kind of a story of the prison in that era's kind of racial problems, led to the Attica uprising. And Attica is an amazing story that your listeners should read Heather Thompson's book or other things to learn about Attica, because their prisoners rose up against many of the same things that drove the hunger strike against the supermax, basic human rights-like conditions. And things were very close to an agreement with the state when, as you probably know the basic story, an army of prison guards and state troopers basically retook the prison, many firing irregular weapons, and dozens of prisoners were killed, and virtually all of the guard hostages were killed by those bullets. But that's not the story that was told to the public. The story that was told to the public, and which I think many prison officers somehow still believe in their bones, even though it's been disproved almost from the beginning, was that the prisoners had gruesomely murdered the hostages, in some cases mutilating them. It turned out within weeks they showed that was absolutely false. I mean, eventually courts put the blame on the bullets. Compensation was paid to the families of correctional officers that died, et cetera. So all of this was meticulously documented from fairly early on. But the big lie got out there, and sort of like the weapons of mass destruction, the lie got out, and much more effectively than the opposite reality. And it's really a moment when I think, for prison officers on a big level and for the rest of us on a somewhat reduced level, prisoners became kind of identified with unacceptable levels of violent risk, a sort of combination of terrorist and Hannibal Lecter type serial killer figure who couldn't be trusted, couldn't be rehabilitated, and needed to be kind of locked down. And I sometimes jokingly say that in the California prison bureaucracy, it's as if 1971, the calendar always reads 1971, and that they've never kind of gotten outside that box. As a culture, we've moved a huge way from that. And that's one of the reasons I think the system is so vulnerable today to your generation, to millennials, to people coming of age now. The basic kind of fear-driven assumptions about our neighbors and the people we live with in our cities is very different. I like to point out that, the whole gig economy, operations like Uber, or Lyft, Airbnb, or Expedia would not have been able to get off the ground in the 70s, given how mistrustful people were of strangers.
That's interesting. Do you see any good reforms in California? It seems like California, there's a lot of changes with prisons, but as far as what you're seeing, what you're hopeful about?
I think the answer has to be yes, that there is a lot of change going on. And I haven't gotten a chance to sort of lay my eyes myself. I think I'm pretty unpopular in the prison bureaucracy. I don't think I'd necessarily. San Quentin, I'd probably be pretty safe to visit because it's kind of their model prison, which itself is fascinating since it's the oldest prison in the state and once the worst. There's certainly a change. The emphasis on education is huge now. They're reinventing parole, and they've got a commitment to providing all kinds of different vocational, rehabilitative, and educational programs that will allow prisoners, currently only prisoners with non-violent-based crimes that sent them to prison, to essentially qualify for early release, which is a big step back toward the earlier model where you give people real incentives to behave like and progress while they're in prison, and give them resources to do that. My biggest concern about the limits of this kind of reform moment has been, one, it's been hugely dependent on the courts forcing us to reduce the population, and we've done it grudgingly, and we've done it without really a loud public acknowledgement that we did real wrong. I mean, this was like a human rights crisis. It led the U.S. Supreme Court to talk about what prisons in a civilized society have to be like. I mean, when you're lectured like that by somebody like Anthony Kennedy, who's, by the way, came from California and is appointed to the court by Ronald Reagan. He's not a flaming liberal by any means. He was appalled by the conditions that he saw in California prisons, and there's been no acknowledgement. I really do think that when you want to change things that have been essentially on the level of human rights abuses, whether it's police violence or prison torture, you've got to start with some kind of public acknowledgement that wrong was done. So we haven't had that. And then the other big problem is, we're still stuck on this violent crime, nonviolent crime line, which is its own kind of hangover of this 1970s fear of this super predator generation that was causing all this violence. So just as we now realize it's crazy to have people in prison for decades for drug or property crimes, it's crazy to have them in prison for decades for violent crimes. Even people who have genuinely committed violent crime, like, say, murder, something that nobody would doubt is a violent crime, doesn't need to be in prison for decades. In most of the world, in Europe, if you're a war criminal, the most you can serve is 25 years. And you might say, well, that's just not enough. But the question is, if you're Tim McVeigh and you kill 135 people, the law is never going to be able to truly reflect the degree of the harm you did through the punishment they inflict. Therefore, we need to reflect on some basic human limits on punishment. And if we look at it from a crime point of view, the statistics are overwhelming that murderers, above all, have extremely low recidivism rates if they've served, more than a decade in prison, for a variety of reasons. So we really need to have that conversation, but we're a long way from doing it yet in California and unfortunately the rest of the country as well.
And I'm glad you touched on drugs, because you can't really talk about prisons without talking about the war on drugs, right?
The war on drugs is a big part of it. I mean, you really saw it when I first started studying California's prison growth in the 1980s. If you look back at the statistics now, a big part of that growth was coming from changing sentences for drug crimes and also using drugs as a reason to send people who had already been released from prison but had a requirement of drug testing during their parole supervision period after prison. A lot of people were being sent to prison for that. And I think there's some misunderstandings about the war on drugs that it might be important to point out here. First of all, the war on drugs was never premised only on the fact that drugs were bad. The claim was that drugs were driving the violent crime that people were really concerned about. And so there was always a relationship there. Now, it was, again, I think based on a misguided assumption that it was somehow the dramatically more aggressive nature of the criminal population in the time that was driving things that led to these long sentences. But the idea was always that somehow this would help America control violent crime. And after all, violent crimes like homicides or robberies are relatively hard to solve and maybe difficult to get convictions on. But if you can just find drugs on people, you can, and then you can sentence them for a long time. I think the implicit argument was trust the prosecutors and police to find the real bad guys, use the severe drug laws to move this population into prison and reduce the level of crime in the community. Now, there were multiple flaws with that model. One is that police and prosecutors were never particularly good judges of who was really driving violent crime in these neighborhoods. They had very little real knowledge of those neighborhoods and very many misconceptions about the very areas they policed. But even when they got people who may well have been involved in, say, gangs in which violence was a byproduct of gang conflict, the basic premise that putting that person in prison would somehow reduce the level of violent crime assumed that the violence was being generated by their internal motivations and not by, the political economy of gangs. And since gangs can always recruit more members, it really didn't do much, and no criminologist believes it did much to reduce the violent crime levels in America. So it was the war on drugs was not quite as sort of absurd a campaign as many people now assume it was, in the sense that it wasn't motivated just by a sort of over-the-top view of how bad drugs was. It was motivated by, I think, a strategic idea that you could use a drug war to reduce violent crime by unleashing harsh punishment. And it went way overboard. Now we get that and we're reducing it. We need to go further and see that the larger model of addressing violence by using the prison as a big sledgehammer of incapacitation is ineffective as well as deeply inhumane strategy.
It's an excellent explanation. Last question. People listening may say, well, this doesn't concern me. I'm never going to be in prison. I'm not a criminal. What would your answer be as to why, this is an important issue for people that are, outside of the criminal justice system and will never see the inside of a prison?
I think there are a lot of ways that it can come back to bite everybody. One is that we've created a huge problem for our communities. People don't stay in prison forever. And when they get out of prison, I don't think that they pose so much of a threat of crime as the damage that's been done to them by the prison experience continues to have all kinds of impacts on their community. One of the most tangible forms is health. I mean, one of the things that I really wrote the book to communicate and that I think people really have to appreciate is that our prisons don't hold the most dangerous people in our country, but they hold some of the most vulnerable people in the country. There are people who are really at risk rather than a source of risk. I mean, all you need to do is look at California's newest prison, which is called the California Medical Facility Stockton, and it's essentially a large penal nursing home. I mean, we have thousands of prisoners who are so vulnerable that they need to be in essentially a nursing home condition. And yet we have electric fences around it and, all of the inhumane and expensive apparatus of prison because we're so fearful of these folks that need that much medical care. So now lots of people get released to the community, but they take those health burdens home. Chronic illness is perhaps the greatest social problem facing America, whether it's diabetes, HIV, cancer. Many doctors now believe that prison not only aggregates people with these medical problems because of the criminalization of poverty, but makes them a good deal worse, because chronic illness is the kind of illness where if you're not regularly getting treated and getting the right kinds of opportunities to get, say, healthier food or exercise, you're on a downward spiral that's essentially irreversible. And when you recognize that, at least as long as Obamacare survives, all of us in some ways as taxpayers are on the hook for the medical costs of our poorest citizens, whether through the Medicaid program or through subsidies in Obamacare, we have a self-interest, I think, in reducing the damage that's being done, to the health of these communities. And, we haven't even begun to talk about kind of some of the other economic damage. I mean, people who have spent a lot of time in prison have a great deal of difficulty getting employed, again, because of the fear that we associate with this population unjustly. But it means, again, a population that has, extreme precarity in their lives through lack of employment and lack of adequate housing. And so those concerns, you may feel like you'll never go to prison, but, if you just bought this groovy new house in a gentrifying neighborhood in Oakland, you may find that there's a tent city in the under the freeway overpass near you of people whose, marginal existence has been created by the prison experience.
It's funny, you mentioned Oakland. We were in San Diego for Thanksgiving, and the amount of homeless people was really amazing. And, I'm sure a lot of them, have been in and out of prisons and jails, a lot of their lives.
No, it's truly shocking. I mean, I think when we begin to think about how to get out of this whole mass imprisonment business, we need to think about the most basic needs of human dignity. And there is no more basic need than even the most simple, but some basic kind of housing. And it's interesting that, in the 1970s, and I should have probably written more about this in my book, was kind of the birth of homelessness, or the decade that we first started noticing the homeless among us. And in some ways, the growing prison population was the other side of the growing homeless population, and the two were going back and forth.
Interesting. Hey, Professor, I would recommend people check out your book, Mass Incarceration on Trial. It's on Amazon. I really enjoyed it. You can get the ebook or the paper book. Professor, can people follow you on Twitter?
They absolutely can. I tweet pretty regularly at Jonathan Simon 59.
Great. Well, hey, Professor, thank you so much for your time. This was a real pleasure. I learned a lot. Hopefully the audience will also. Thank you so much.
Thanks for hosting me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.